Good morning, everyone. I'm here with another history video this morning. Today I'm talking about something that seems particularly appropriate given our recent temperatures. I'm going to talk about some of the very special quilts that we have in our collection at Thistle Cottage. We're featuring two different quilts in today's video, although our collection does include several others. Our first featured quilt today was pieced by William H. Reynolds of Greenville. Willie Reynolds was born in September 1869. We don't know exactly when he started this quilt, but he worked on it off and on for several years before his death at the age of 77 in 1947. Instead of working on the quilt as one large bed-sized piece, Uncle Willie, as he was known, created several smaller squares of about 20 to 22 inches, each featuring many irregular cuts of fabric sewn together and embellished with embroidery. Uncle Willie died before he pieced his blocks together into one quilt, but his niece, Margaret Booney Hunt, received the blocks after his death. She kept them safe, and the Muhlenberg County Quilt Guild attached the pieces together in the mid-1990s. The resulting quilt was eventually donated to us for display. When the pieces were attached, 3 blocks were left over, and these were framed and are also displayed at Thistle Cottage. Our second quilt featured today is very interesting, but it does have a little bit of a sad story. This quilt was pieced by Aurora Jessup of Clifty in Todd County. Aurora was born in 1879. With help from her family, she pieced this quilt top together for her hope chest after becoming engaged to be married. The quilt is very much a souvenir piece done by a young girl who was preparing to leave her family. Many of the fabrics used came from clothing owned and previously worn by family members, and the initials embroidered on the quilt in several areas symbolize Aurora's siblings. Unfortunately, Aurora contracted typhoid and died at the age of 26 in 1905 before she was married. After her remaining family died, the quilt top, which was apparently finished even though there was no sort of backing yet added to it, was given to the library and eventually came to us at Thistle Cottage, where it is part of our permanent collection and is displayed off and on throughout the year. Some areas are worn and damaged, due in part to age and in part to the fabrics used, which include silk and other fine fabrics. If you watched our earlier video about the Duncan wedding dress from our collection, you'll know that silk is particularly susceptible to damage as it ages. Those worn areas were repaired and/or reinforced several years ago, and a backing was added to help stabilize the piece, but we still try to limit the quilt's exposure to light and to fluctuations in humidity and temperature due to its fragility. Since the quilt is already so fragile, even with the added backing, we cannot hang it up for display as we do with the Reynolds quilt, but we don't want to keep it in storage constantly where no one is able to enjoy it. After consulting with a textiles conservation expert, we keep the Jessup quilt on a padded rack, and we carefully flip and refold it as necessary to prevent any particular area from overexposure. And so more of the quilt can be seen by returning visitors to Thistle Cottage. Uncle Willie Reynolds' quilt does not have as much damage, but we still keep an eye on light levels in the area where the quilt and the framed blocks are displayed. The frames do help provide some additional protection from normal temperature changes and moisture in the air. Both of those quilts we've just shown and talked about are examples of what is known as a crazy quilt. Crazy quilts are a little different from some other quilts you may have seen in the past. They're patchwork, just like many others, but they don't feature a regular pattern or design. Instead, the quilt is pieced together from many small scraps of fabric, often cut from old clothing or other recycled items, like Aurora Jessup did with her quilt, in an irregular, so-called crazy design. Crazy quilts were very popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s, with their popularity often attributed to artworks shown at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876. American quilters began to emulate techniques from English embroidery and Japanese silk screening and ceramic work in their own textiles, including decorative quilts. The crazy quilt designs are said to be inspired by the cracked glaze on the Japanese pottery shown at the exposition. Like the Jessup quilt and the Reynolds quilt, crazy quilts often feature embroidery along the seams and sometimes on the individual pieces of fabric as a way to showcase the maker's talents and add extra decoration to the quilt. Other embellishments, such as ribbons and buttons, are sometimes added as well. Both of our crazy quilts use some fancy fabrics like silk and velvet. Since early crazy quilts were made primarily for decorative or artistic purposes, that was common. They're also called city quilts since they were originally created by urban, wealthier crafters. Later on, crazy quilts spread to more rural areas and began to be made for more practical uses, typically featuring sturdier, everyday fabrics such as cotton that would hold up better to heavy use. Those sturdier versions are often also known as country quilts. Both of our quilts that we've been talking about are local, so you might expect them to fall into the latter category of a more utilitarian covering. However, since Aurora Jessup made her quilt for a hope chest, it makes sense that she would have used the best, fanciest fabric she could find and would have added elaborate embroidery to her quilt. And since Willie Reynolds was quilting for a hobby, not just for a warm bed covering, that explains his choice of fabrics and embroidery as well. These particular two quilts are fairly involved, and many of the fabric scraps used are very small. That isn't always the case, even with crazy quilts, especially country quilts. Sometimes the pieces are a little larger, making the quilt easier and faster to complete, even compared to a traditional pattern quilt, since the creator doesn't have to worry about the finished result looking a certain way. However, crazy quilts made with smaller pieces like these could often involve a lot of time and effort, much more than you might expect from a more traditional quilt. In fact, an issue of Harper's Bazaar from 1884 includes an estimate that more intricate crazy quilts could require as much as 1,500 hours of work. That means that a solo quilter who stitched for 2 hours a day could expect a quilt to take more than 2 years to finish. Crazy quilts also, unlike traditional quilts, often don't feature any actual quilting, which is the act of sewing through several layers of fabric to attach them together. Traditionally, quilts would include a top, the pattern part made of several blocks or pieces of fabric sewn into a design, an inner batting or stuffing for extra warmth, and another fabric backing that could either be pieced together like the top or made of just 1 or 2 pieces of fabric, depending on the quilter's wishes and the material they had available. All those layers are sewn together, often using a decorative pattern of stitching like swirls or geometric shapes, to hold all the pieces in place and prevent the inner layer from bunching up anywhere as the quilt is used or laundered. Some quilts do replace the quilting stitches with several yarn or string ties placed at intervals across the quilt, which serves the same purpose of holding everything in place as the quilting stitches do. But crazy quilts often don't have either of those things, and in fact often don't include the inner layer at all. This was even more common in the fancier city quilts since they were designed primarily as decoration rather than for everyday use. And in true crazy quilt fashion, neither our Jessup quilt or Reynolds quilt have any actual quilting on them. Both of them were received as unfinished quilt tops, so it's impossible to say what the creator's full intentions were, but it's unlikely they would have added any quilting stitches to what were already pretty intricate, busy-looking textiles. In addition to our crazy quilts, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we do have several other more traditional quilts in our collection at Thistle Cottage with different patterns. We even have one quilt featuring the embroidered names of ladies that lived in Paradise, Kentucky before the town was, as they say, hauled away to make way for the TVA plant. We were told that one of the women who lived in Paradise was moving away with her family, and the other ladies made this quilt and embroidered it with their names so she could take it as a souvenir of her neighbors and friends, similar to the way our Jessup quilt includes the initials of Aurora's siblings. We have additional quilts as well, including some designed with flower or other block patterns. The information we have on those quilts varies, unfortunately. Many of them have little to no origin story remaining. But what we do know is that those quilts were likely sewn with care, either to decorate a family home or to keep the family warm in cold winters, or both. Quilts are multi-purpose that way. If you have handmade quilts at home, they are a treasure. They can help tell your family's story in more than one way, either with biographical information stitched into them as with the Jessup quilt, or by using fabrics that were maybe collected from family members and held some significance to them, or even just with the fact that they were created by a family member as a piece of art, like the Reynolds quilt, or as an act of care to protect family members from harsh weather. On a personal note, I own several quilts that were made by either my grandmother or my great-aunt, and they're some of my most prized possessions. I know a lot of work and care and love went into those, and I hold them very dear. And of course, the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, only a couple of hours or less away from here, has a large collection of newer quilts of all types. So if you're interested in quilting as an art, that museum, as well as Thistle Cottage of course, is a great spot to visit without even having to leave our own fair state. Thank you for joining us this morning for this edition of our Thistle Cottage History Throwback series. I hope you've enjoyed seeing a few more artifacts from our collection at Thistle Cottage, and maybe learned a little bit about some items you may even have in your own homes. We'll be back again next month with another history video, so if you enjoyed today's quilts, make sure you follow or subscribe. Have a great week, everyone. Stay warm.